This is week 8 of our class. This is the final podcast. And today we talk about two chapters, chapter 14 and 16, having to do with taxes and education. So that's 14 and 16. Anyway, let's get started. The first question, what type of taxes at the state and local level are there? And let me see, the question actually reads, what are the types of taxes at the state and local level? So here's what you have. You have at the local level, primarily for the local level, you have the property tax. That is people paying anybody who owns buildings. So that would be homes or businesses or whatever, except for churches where you have a religious exemption. They don't pay property taxes, but everybody else does. And so it depends on how big your house is or how big the building is, where you do business, whatever. And that money is collected, property tax usually collected like twice a year. You pay. For example, when I lived in River Forest, I was in a townhouse, and I paid about 2,600 for a small townhouse. I don't know how many square feet that was, but 1,500 or something. It was very small. Anyway, you paid it twice a year. You pay it to the county clerk's office, and that money then used for all the functions of local government that we talked about in the very beginning of the class, like education, uh, streets, like streets and sanitation in Chicago, where they clean the snow and clean the streets in the summertime and all that kind of stuff. So whatever expenses, personnel, whatever the expenses are at the local level, whatever kind of things they spend money on, property taxes where they get the money. The second type of tax is the sales tax. Now the sales tax is administered by all three levels of government: national, state, and local. Classic example would be gasoline. So on a gasoline, you have about half the money that you pay in tax for a gallon of gasoline. About half of that goes to the company that has, producing the gas, and the rest goes to taxes, national, state, and local. Um, Probably in Chicago, you pay the highest amount of money for gas because there's so many local governments grabbing onto that. So, um, like I said, the property tax is the primary source of income for local government, and only local government charges that. But the sales tax, they all do, and they all take a piece of it. Recently in New Mexico, they just started taxing um, purchases on the internet. That just started a few months ago. And so they collect taxes on as many companies that are doing business over the internet in the state of New Mexico that are willing to participate in the system. Um, so it's probably every kind of business here that has some kind of brick and mortar building, or anybody else they can get to send them back the tax. Income tax is primarily state and national. The national government relies heavily on the income tax. I should have said that the state relies heavily on sales tax. So most of the money that's going to local governments coming from the property tax, most of the money that's raised by the state is coming from the sales tax, and then the income tax, most of the money raised by income tax goes to the national government. So that's basically what the breakdown is. But states also get some income tax money as well from every citizen out there. Then there's what I call the sin taxes. And the sin taxes are tax on things that are not supposed to be necessary um, for a livelihood, and that would include essentially, historically, has included um, gasoline, cigarettes, and alcohol. So those have been the basic ones, and they're heavily taxed. Whenever you talk about sin taxes, you're talking about big, heavy sales taxes on on those kinds of items, because it's a feeling, or it always was, that this is something that it's easy to tax, because um, poor people who disproportionately pay sales tax, that is, they pay a larger proportion of their income in sales tax than do more affluent people. That's why it's called a regressive tax. Um, People who pay or getting those things, cigarettes, alcohol. I'm not sure why they still include gasoline in that. Um, those things are uh, generally considered to be non-essential, and so heavy taxes are a good idea. Even the idea that if you charge enough, and they certainly charge huge amounts of taxes on cigarettes, um, that it's also a deterrent, and that's an argument too, to raise more money, get people to be discouraging people from using the product. I'm not sure it does. Um, Cigarettes are very addictive, and so people who smoke probably can't stop, even no matter what the price is. Anyway, that's the kind of idea. And here recently, I talked about this when I did talked about taxes for the other class. That recently here we just the public just voted on a soda tax. So that'd be another kind of category, would belong in the same category, non-essential item, pop, and also something like cigarettes, where it's argued that people are obese because, in part, they drink a lot of soda, especially kids, and there's a high degree of obesity among children in the United States, unbelievable numbers of obesity of all the population. And the argument would be that if you had a soda tax, it would discourage people from drinking sugar drinks, and therefore may um, uh, reduce obesity. Kind of a silly idea, if you ask me, but nonetheless, it's out there. Another thing is gambling. Almost every state now has a lottery system, and many states have casino gambling as well. They used to have bingo games. You don't see that too much anymore, but you had some of that, and you still do. You still have some bingo, where churches and places like that, which originated bingo games, contribute a sizable portion of the money raised to the state. Now, most of that money, in terms of gambling, goes to the state government. And when they first started, they argue that the money will be used for education or some really essential function of state government, and then eventually they kind of just throw it in the general fund. And then the last thing is user fees, and that's something that has really been increased in recent years, as governments at the state and local level have had to rely less and less on the national government. It used to be, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, the national government was giving huge grant and aids to the states, and then they were distributing that money not only to themselves but to the local government as well. And so both became very dependent on the national government. Then along in about 1980, when President Reagan came along, this money was dramatically reduced, and states are on their own. That's why states are in part so poor these days, especially states that are poor to begin with, places like New Mexico, which were poor to begin with, and then the national government not contributing to them like they once did, and therefore they have fewer and fewer dollars, and they have to figure out how to raise more money in order to just break even, which in effect we're not doing, not breaking even. So one of the ways you do it is by increasing user fees or starting user fees in areas where once you had things for free, like for example museums. People used to be able to go to museums or any places that were run by the city or local government, run by local government, that those things would be free to residents, so you wouldn't have to pay, um, like to go to the Art Institute or someplace like that, or you wouldn't have to pay for a library card or whatever service is being provided. And nowadays, that's pretty rare. Nowadays, there's almost nothing free, and they're charging user fees and raising user fees all the time. And even you'll even see areas where there's something called a special assessment when the city decides they're going to put in new roads in your neighborhood, or they're going to uh, make some kind of improvement in the community, fiber optics or whatever. They'll give you a special assessment, that is all the people who are affected in that area where they're making the improvements, that what they'll do is charge them extra money. So maybe you have to pay an additional $1,000 per family or something like that. So user fees, which we kind of take for granted these days, but in effect in the old days used to be free to go to any events and activities that were paid originally paid for by taxpayers. So anyway, that's one. Second question is, what seems most appropriate at the local level? What tax seems most appropriate for local government? And here are the questions you have to consider. What is the least regressive? Now, regressive tax means that regressive meaning it's not it's a negative thing. It's you're charging more money to people who are poor and less money to people who are rich. Not in the sense that every time you go in there and to buy something, you go in a store and you buy a pack of gum, that rich people are charged less than poor people. No, that's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about is that they pay for items that are taxed with sales tax, essentially, that poor people pay a larger portion of their income than do rich people. So in effect, poor people are paying more money than rich people. That's what they mean. So sales tax is regressive. Property tax can be regressive, and for the most part it is, because a lot of older people who don't have income anymore used to have income, but when they were working, and now when they're older and retired, they don't have income. They have to pay same amounts of property tax as people who are rich who have the same home. So basically, the same size home, and you pay the same amount of money, and so that makes that tax regressive as well. The only tax that's really considered to be progressive, that is, the rich pay more and poor pay less, would be income tax. And even that is questionable, because there's a lot of exemptions in the law. They're always talking about reforming it. President Trump is talking about reforming the tax structure or income tax structure right now, but it never seems to get done. So essentially, if you look at the reality of it, it isn't very progressive, because it's only progressive as far as it's more, let's put it this way, it's more progressive than the sales tax, because the poor are paying less, or maybe not at all depends on what their level of income is. But the middle class is primarily paying the large share of the income tax, not the rich, because they have exemptions that get them out of it. So anyway, that's one thing you have to consider: progressive or progressive or regressive. The second thing is what's politically possible. You have to keep in mind that in the 21st century, most people don't like taxes, and taxes are considered to be very negative. And whenever politicians talk about increasing taxes, they get in trouble. You can go back to President Bush, the first President Bush, not W, but his father, when he ran against President Clinton, and it was Governor Clinton then and President Bush. President Bush got in trouble by saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then he raised taxes, and people just made him pay for that. And he didn't get reelected; Clinton did. So that's something to consider. How are you going to increase services or maintain services at the current levels without raising taxes? Because politicians are not going to get blamed for it, especially executive politicians like governors and presidents. I don't want to be blamed for what happens. And so the end result is they're not going to raise taxes. Like, for example, here in the state of New Mexico, the governor, Martinez, what she said the other day was that she had no intention of raising taxes, and that what she would do is she cut the pensions of public school teachers and make them pay their own contribution to pensions instead of raising taxes. So they do almost anything, alienate teachers, which is not a good thing to do. But alienating teachers, they'd rather do that than the expense of increasing taxes for the general public. The third thing is what's the easiest to collect and administer. Now, most taxes, like probably the easiest to administer would be the sales tax, because that's collected by businesses. They're not even government employees that collect those taxes and then send them into the government. So that's the easiest to administer. What's hard to administer would be the property tax, because you need assessors who go around determining how much the property's worth, and then evaluations and complaints from the public, and then concerns about that, and then there's a whole operation of appeals. So it's a very expensive operation to administer the process of property tax. Income tax is the same kind of thing. You need a lot of people collecting it, and then evaluating whether people pay the right amounts and all that sort of thing. So probably the easiest one to collect would be a sales tax. And then finally, what's most acceptable to the public, who are, as I said, discontented with taxes. So when you make up your mind, and I won't say much more than that, when you make up your own mind, you have to keep in mind all four of these things. So probably a good answer to this question, what's most appropriate, would be to address all four concepts here. What, in terms of what one you pick. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Number 3, why does it seem that the public educational system is failing us? Well, here's some reasons why I think it appears to be failing, and it seems to me in my entire adult life I've seen this. There was a report way back in the 1950s which talked about why Johnny can't read, and it was, the public educational system is failing us. And it seems to me we've seen that all along, most recently with President Bush, that is W, the son, the second President Bush, with his No Child Left Behind. The whole concept of No Child Left Behind was that the educational system is failing us. Well, anyway, here's some of the reasons. First of all, it's a very ambitious goal. The concept of educating everyone is unique to the United States. No place else in the world really tries to educate everybody. Most places, what you have is an elitist education, where the only people who go to college are the people who can pass tests when they're about 15 or 16 is the last time you take tests. general education test, and only those that pass it go to a college, and then everybody else goes to some kind of trade school. And of course, the people that pass it are more likely to have gone to prestigious schools in the beginning. So start out in a preschool and then go to grade school and then go to a high school. That's going to make sure that you are prepared to take that test. Everybody else winds up in some kind of trade school and becomes a plumber or an electrician or cab driver or something like that. The second thing is that too much is expected of the system. You know, we expect teachers and the educational system to take care of our kids, to feed them, babysit them, to educate them, to do the whole 9 yards. And we're starting these days out in, preschool, not only just starting with the kindergarten where kids are 6 years old and then they go to school. We have preschool now. And all of that is aimed at trying to get a head start or get kids prepared because they're not being prepared at home, especially poor kids, kids who come from bilingual families, for example, who learn, say, Spanish in the home when they're first born, and then all the way up until they go to school, they speak Spanish. Well, they're at a kind of disadvantage because of the educational system is aimed at English speakers. And I used to see that when I lived in one apartment when I was in Chicago. I think it was the first one after I got divorced, and I was, the landlord was Hispanic. He was from Mexico. He owned a building, and I used to tutor his kids, and I think 3 days a week I would tutor the kids. There were 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, and what I discovered right away was they did very well in the subjects that didn't require a lot of English. So like they were really good at math, computer science, stuff like that, because it didn't require the language. They just did not have the typical vocabulary, understanding the vocabulary of English, the way English-speaking kids from the get-go have, and especially kids who have educated parents. So, those kids go to school, and then we expect the school to somehow elevate them to a much higher level, and that just doesn't happen. And that kind of problem is really demonstrated here in New Mexico because the population, we have a lot of Hispanics here, we have a lot of American Indians, and they tend to be poor. And again, they tend to be bilingual, and they tend to be not nearly up to the standards of the white kind of Euro-Western educational system that we basically utilize in this country. Number 3 is teachers are limited. Teaching, I'm talking especially about teachers at the grade school and high school levels, are not considered very highly prestigious in the United States, and therefore we tend not to draw the best. The educational system of educating teachers also isn't considered the best. Like if you think about like what departments within the educational system, like when you're going to school, think about like what majors are most prestigious and which are least prestigious. I don't have to say much more to let you know what I'm trying to say, and that is that prestige is usually in stuff like pre-med or sciences or something like that. And so everybody else who's trying to make their way in the academic environment of a college is in a lower position. And teachers are generally have been that way. I think part and parcel of why that's been the case is that most, in the past anyway, most of the people who went into teaching were women, and women have been discriminated against in terms of income and all the rest. So anyway, so that's what I mean by teachers are limited. And plus, I mean, we're really demanding a lot of teachers that they bring these students up to standards when the family isn't doing it at home. Um, when I grew up, my family was poor, and they didn't really help much in terms of education. My father went to the fourth grade, and then he got a job, and hard to believe, but yeah, he got a job and he was working. He never got any more formal education than that. My mother went to, I think, 2 years of high school, um, and then she went to some kind of secretarial school later on. But she didn't finish high school. My dad didn't even finish grade school. So they weren't very helpful in terms of providing a lot of uh, preparation in the home for my education. My education was primarily, formal education was primarily um, confined to what I learned in the schools. To give you some example, they didn't read any books. There were no books in the house except for my school books and my brother and sister's books. But they didn't have any books for us to read. They didn't read to us or anything like that. So what we learned, we had to learn in school, and that's a major burden on the part of the school system, and that's what I'm talking about. So I said this already, teachers lack the prestige, and therefore it's hard to attract people, especially to grade schools and high schools where so much is demanded. Um, it's very hard on those people too, because they're criticized all the time for not raising the standards of their students. And it got even worse when we started using standardized testing. And then the last thing is that we really aren't teaching people, because we're using standardized tests, we're not teaching people to love education and to go learn on their own. One of the things that I think my generation did was we had these notions, probably got them from television and the movies, that we should be educated people, and that was going to make our life better. And so we started reading on our own. We read things, books, magazines, and so on that we could get our hands on, mainly through the library. Uh, so because and so we developed a kind of, especially when we read novels, I think you gain a real appreciation for what those authors would do and how wonderful it was to have a practice of reading. And that lasts you throughout your life. It's lifelong learning. Appreciation of learning makes you a lifelong learner. But if you're just gonna be taught to pass tests, and you just care about tests, I just want an A on a test, and then I can forget about whatever I was supposedly learned. That's not what an educational system should be doing, and unfortunately that's where we're at, especially in grade schools and high schools with so much emphasis on standardized testing. You might think about this in the future for yourself, that when you go to college, I always say, if you want to determine whether your college education took, that is, did you really learn anything, is what are you doing after you get out of college? What are you reading? What are you studying? What are you paying attention to? And if you're not reading anything other than what you have to read for work, um, I think you got to reevaluate yourself. Anyway, that's just an idea. I went off the track. The last thing is reforms in education. What are some of the reforms? Well, we're still talking about most of these, and we're still doing most of these kind of things. Vouchers, for one thing. The voucher system is the idea that instead of giving the money to public schools, um, and financing public schools that you consider to be bad public schools, just giving them money to kind of keep their same level of incompetency. You have vouchers, and vouchers are money that you give to students. It's like writing every student who is potentially going to the public school in the neighborhood. You write them a check so he can go somewhere else. So he or she can just kind of decide what school you want to go to. So you take your voucher and you spend it on whatever school you want to go to. You don't have to go to your neighborhood school. That's the idea of vouchers. And supposedly that would make the less good schools, not so good schools, better, and or make them go out of business, and everybody else would go to the good schools. It's a theory. It's just a theory. It doesn't really work in practice. There's a lot of negatives about the voucher system. I won't go into them here, but enough to say it's just a theory. When it's been tried in practice, it doesn't work so well. Standardized testing is another thing. All students should be required to take a standard test, and then they would take that test, and if they don't pass it, they wouldn't be promoted. So you have certain levels. This would be like the European system, where you have at certain times in the career of a student, he has to take a standardized test. Say you start in the 4th grade, and then again in the 7th grade, and so on. And if you don't pass these standardized tests, then you don't get promoted. And everybody's taking the same test, so it seems to be, or it's said to be, a fair test. Well, standardized testing has a lot of problems in it as well. I won't spend the time going into what some of them are, but essentially there's no real good way. Let me put it this way. There's no real good way to measure whether people learn or not. I mean, I've been teaching for 46 years, something like that. And I can tell you that students learn on their own pace, and they learn at their own level, and no standardized test can ever measure that. You may figure it out. You may figure something out 2 or 3 years after you graduate, and the standardized test didn't measure that. Or maybe the standardized test is full of a lot of trivia that somebody thinks is really important to know. Most likely, that's what standardized tests are made of. I've participated in writing some standardized tests myself, and I never liked any of them. Another thing is charter schools. Now, charter schools are schools that are privately run, and they're kind of how to get around the public school system as it now exists. The idea is that a charter school is going to be a school that overcomes the bureaucratic limitations of a public school, like teachers' unions, limited curriculum, limited methodology. And so if you have a charter school, you can pretty much run it any way you want. You don't have to hire teachers who are unionized. You can develop your own curriculum, a whole variety of things like that, which supposedly overcome the limitations of the typical public school. The problem with charter schools is that they were raved about in the beginning. They tend not to be achieving much. Most of the tests show that the old-fashioned regular public school kids achieve at the same levels as kids in the charter schools. Magnet schools is another thing that's kind of like similar to the charter school, but it usually has like a theme or something. You see these in Chicago, and it usually has like a theme that they operate with, and like maybe they teach foreign language in every class or something along those lines, or the music or something. So there's a special advantage to going to that school. And then finally, the last one is homeschooling, where parents are teaching their own kids at home, and there's online help for all this. If you just look it up, you can see that there's all kinds of curriculum efforts to identify what you should be teaching math to your kids that are fourth grade or fifth grade or whatever. And so a lot of educated parents are doing that. They're not sending their kids to school. They're schooling them at home. And like I said, there's all kinds of help for that, and more parents are taking advantage of it because they're afraid to send their kids to public school. And sometimes you could see that. There's worries about things like drugs and crime and all kinds of bullying and all the negative things you hear about in terms of public schools. But at the same time, I just think there's a problem with it, and the problem is that when kids go to school, just like when kids go to college, they're going essentially to be socialized as well as educated. So part of your education is the socialization process. That is, you're learning how to behave and communicate and live with your fellow citizens. And that's something you wouldn't learn if you were taught by your mother instead of some stranger who becomes your teacher. So I just think that's part of why people go to college. I mean, if you were just to get an online degree, it wouldn't be the same thing. And one of the reasons why most college students, who are going away to college or living on a campus or something, the reason they do that is not because they want to spend all the money that is required for that kind of education, but because they see education as more than just classrooms and quantifying the amount of information you learn, all of which is important, but there's a socialization process too. The fact that you have an opportunity to live on your own, be away from your parents, all the rest that helped you grow up, especially in this day and age when most students or most people, I should say, young people have a hard time moving out of the house. All right, well, anyway, that's probably enough for this the last session.